The United States has given Saudi Arabia the ability, in theory, to produce its own nuclear fuel, nuclear waste, and therefore a nuclear bomb. With me is Center for Security Policy scholar David Wurmser. I'm J. Michael Waller at the Center for Security Policy, Senior Analyst for Strategy, and we're talking about a new policy paper we have on proliferation called Hold the Line on Enrichment. It's a technical paper, but it's a policy paper to discuss, is it a really good idea for us to be giving this to the Saudis? So, Dave Wurmser, what do you think?
Well, to give it to them as a national asset is really problematic. I think the way we approached it in the report was that while they should probably have access to a nuclear fuel cycle as part of a consortium that is under the ultimate control of the United States rather than a national asset, the problem we have with the national asset is that the moment you give countries certain nuclear technologies, it's a benchmark for the region and for other countries in the region. And there are nations like the UAE and others that gave up a lot in order to get access to nuclear technologies under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or otherwise known as NPT. And now all of a sudden, those countries must be asking, well, what exactly did we do? We gave up what we didn't have to give up because the Saudis now get this whole cycle.
Right. So what this is all about really is these countries are going to run out of oil and gas someday. And they understand it. It's inevitable. And so Saudi Arabia, like some of its neighbors, wants to have civilian nuclear energy for, normal commercial purposes. But it's got a neighbor, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has its own nuclear program that was begun under the Shah for energy, but has become its own nuclear weapons program, and that's where we are today. How did it happen that way first, and what does the Saudi arrangement mean for us?
Well, let's start with Iran. Iran entered the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in good faith under the Shah, where they really did believe that they need to develop nuclear power. It was a very sophisticated country. It was industrializing. It was reaching to become really OECD, Organization of Economically Cooperating. I forgot what OECD stands for, but nonetheless, it is basically the industrialized world, and they were aiming for that. So they joined the NPT, and then they joined in order to get this nuclear technology in order to genuinely build a civilian nuclear program. But then came the Islamic Revolution, and their continuation in the Non-Proliferation Treaty turned from a legitimate program to try to have a civilian energy structure into a bad faith continuation in that program to essentially have access to all the benefits of being in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but then cheat and use those benefits in order and leverage them in order to have the technology, the materials, the nuclear trade, and so forth, in order to under the table reach for a clandestine nuclear program. And it was very early that there started being signs of that, but certainly by 2000 it was blatantly clear that they were cheating right and left, up and down, in order to race for a bomb.
So Iran was supposed to be developing nuclear power for peaceful purposes under the Shah. So you had when Iran was run by a civilized government. But we still had to keep Iran at its word. And then somewhere along the way, it got to manufacture what is called have its own life cycle of nuclear fuel, meaning from getting the raw material to enriching it to turning it into actual fuel, and then taking and processing the waste and building a bomb. How did that work?
Well, what happens is when you join the NPT and you have access to this, generally other nations can trade with you to build a nuclear reactor for energy, but you don't have the ability to produce the fuel. The fuel, essentially, you mine uranium, you reprocess it into yellowcake, which is sort of a powder, and then you start spinning it in centrifuges successively until you reach a purity that allows the uranium put into rods to start having the chain reactions that are necessary for nuclear power. Now, if you keep going and you keep enriching it, you eventually get to uranium that is so pure that you can use it for a bomb. So there's inherently a danger once a nation has the mastery of producing its own fuel. There's no real firewall, ultimately, between being able to get to the 3 to 5%, which is the enrichment level that is necessary for a fuel rod. There's no real firewall between that and the 90% for a bomb. Because it's the same technology, the same centrifuges. The piping gets switched a little bit. But it is essentially, once you're there at 5%, you're there at 90%. It's just how long you spin the centrifuges. And worse, if it takes 100 days to reach a certain amount of fuel at 5%, that's already half the work. To get from 5% to 90% is only 50% of the effort, because once you're at 5%, you're already in a state where when you keep spinning the centrifuges, it accelerates how much it separates out the uranium isotopes.
So that's why when we then struck those centrifuges, there was a whole controversy about what they were and how much they were actually purifying the uranium. When Trump struck those, he was shutting down their ability to have more enriched nuclear fuel for a bomb. So then the key around this is to have you sell the nuclear fuel that's already processed directly to these countries to use in their reactors, and then when that fuel is spent, you remove that fuel, you take the waste back, and then you sell them fresh nuclear fuel, right?
Exactly. Now, there are a few nations in the world, other than the 5 known nuclear powers under the NPT, which are Russia, China, France, Britain, and the United States, and the 2 formally other nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, and the assumed nuclear power, Israel. Those are the only 8 that have known to have or are heavily reported and assumed to have nuclear weapons, and therefore they have the full fuel cycle. There are a few other nations that have the fuel cycle too, Japan and so forth. And there was a consortium in Europe called Urenco, and they also had the full fuel cycle. But to have the full fuel cycle, you have to submit to an even more intense and intrusive level of inspections. It's called the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, additional protocols. So you can, if you're Japan, you can have your fuel cycle, but you are really opening yourself up to full visibility, because the IAEA must certify that there's been no diversion of that technology or materials to a nuclear weapons program. And if it cannot certify it, automatically you are in breach of the NPT, and it's referred to the Security Council. And usually that means there are sanctions, and you're not in good standing in the IAEA, which means all nations have to halt trading, all activity has to stop, and so forth. The problem we have with Iran is they clearly stole, under the NPT, nuclear expertise. They gained it. Which included all sorts of things. Then they stole from the consortium in Europe. It was really through it's sort of a secondary, tertiary result. But somebody stole the technology from Urenco in Europe, the consortium in Europe, gave it to a guy, A.Q. Khan. He was an arms trader. He set up the A.Q. Khan network, which is how Pakistan got the bomb and the bomb-making material. They essentially pilfered it. And then Iran, Iraq, Libya, all the rest of them got it from A.Q. Khan. But bottom line is they had a nuclear fuel cycle without having the monitoring structure. They were in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to do so, and they were using the Non-Proliferation Treaty to gain the benefits.
So there was nothing that we could do except militarily attack them.
Either that or diplomatically lean on them so much that they give it up.
Yeah, but that didn't happen. So meanwhile, though, you have Iran's neighbor right across the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, has its own civilian nuclear fuel system, but it was content to have a deal, the gold standard deal, right? So to have foreign suppliers like the U.S. sell them the fuel, and then they would use the fuel, and then we take back the spent fuel and send them new fuel. That's the gold standard, and that's the standard that we'd like for really the rest of the world to have. What makes the Saudi case different?
Well, the Saudi case is different because we're essentially selling them this fuel cycle. Now, that means they would have to be under the additional protocols. But again, the real issue, there's two issues here. One is, basically, other than Japan and a few others that already had the reprocessing ability decades ago, we really haven't seen any other nations cross that threshold or want to cross that threshold because it really isn't very useful for them. I mean, you can buy if you're under the NPT in good standing, you can buy what you need in terms of fuel, and there are efficient economies of scale for fuel elsewhere in the world.
Trusted partner.
Yeah, so there's the only incentive for many of these nations to go for a full fuel cycle is if either they don't trust anybody to sell it to them, which, given the fact that we're having a problem with too many people selling too many things, is not that real right now. The other fear is it could be diverted for a nuclear weapons program.
So then the controversy now, which is the subject of our policy paper called "Hold the Line on Enrichment," is that we're giving sovereign enrichment and reprocessing, it's really our own technology, the holy grail of our technology, right, to Saudi Arabia so that they can do it on their own. And really, we've pretty much stuck it to the United Arab Emirates and others who've chosen to go by the gold standard.
That's where the Saudi case is problematic, and we'll get back to Iran in a second. There are a lot of nations that were heading toward a fuel cycle who in the 70s and 60s gave it up because it was part of the non-proliferation effort of the world. And all of a sudden, if we now start crossing the bar into these fuel cycle nations, you're going to start seeing the whole NPT structure beginning to unravel. This is where Iran and North Korea became such critical problems because under the JCPOA,
that's the Iran deal.
It's the Iran deal from 2015 that President Obama signed with the Iranians. We caught them cheating. We caught them cheating up, down, right, left. We caught them having a full fuel cycle. We caught them diverting fuel from the fuel cycle to weaponization activities, numerous weaponization activities, not just one. And we also caught them trying to find a second track to a bomb, which is called reprocessing from the plutonium route. That's when you have a heavy water reactor. Essentially, you are producing, by the very act of producing energy, you are enriching what the fuel cell is. So, the bottom line, though, is President Obama, in order to bring Iran back into compliance, did not force them to give up the fuel cycle. He instead validated the fuel cycle and said, well, submit to some inspections. So we cut a sweetheart deal for Iran. And that is the source of the problem, because then the Saudis said, because nuclear power is not only about power and it's not only about diversion, it's also status. Who is the great nation of the region? So the Saudis were saying, listen, we can't let the Iranians be the ones who the whole world grovels around, that acknowledges as so sophisticated and so great that it is now a peer in terms of nuclear issues with the United States and France and Russia and China, etc. So it's if they can have it, we should have it.
So the Saudis then had a double motive. They had Iran as a strategic rival for them. And if Iran had nuclear weapons, then the Saudis would want to have them as well. That makes sense from a national defense point of view if they don't trust us. But then you had, everyone's going to be, the whole world will be kowtowing to Iran and leaving Saudi Arabia out there pretty much in the desert. So it would be diplomatically second fiddle to the Iranians as a status symbol.
Exactly. So the answer to that we came up with in a report is you really can't stop them as long as we had essentially allowed them to have it. By the way, we have the same problem with North Korea. It set a new bar that is very dangerous because they crossed the threshold and then they went for a bomb and nobody did anything about it. So we basically, in this report, it says, okay, listen, we're not going to deny you this technology, but what we would like to have is not what we're heading toward, which is we just sell you what the technology, and then maybe, if we're lucky, you submit to the additional protocols and you don't cheat, and someday in the future, if you reconsider, you won't tap into it for a nuclear weapon. What we decided was, okay, if you can't deny it, then create a consortium that is essentially still under American control. It's technology we still maintain control over. We buy back the fuel. We give them the structure. So that way you essentially, A, you monitor, but B, we're really in the center of it all. It's a little bit like Aramco. It's a consortium and
That's the Saudi oil company.
Right. We still provide a lot of the technology for Aramco. Without us, without our engineers and so forth, Aramco can't quite easily function. And that's essentially the idea here, is to make, on the one hand, give it to some of our regional allies, but on the other hand, continue to make it contingent, dependent on our validation, our koshering. Perhaps that's the wrong word for the Middle East, but our koshering of the program by being in control of it, essentially.
So really, this is a huge boon to the American nuclear energy business and to our tech hardware business overall.
Yes, exactly.
So let me look at a few points that are in this report called "Hold the Line on Enrichment," and there are 4 points here that explain the logic in very simple terms. If Iran is allowed to keep its nuclear enrichment, Saudi Arabia will demand enrichment. We just discussed that. If Saudi Arabia obtains enrichment, the United Arab Emirates gold standard collapses, which is the one that benefits us most. So it will be collapsing. If that collapses, then future regional deals become case-by-case bargaining, haggling, as opposed to principled non-proliferation. That's third. So it just becomes whimsical, and then you're spreading the problem. So if that happens, then the last point, the United States will have manufactured the very proliferation cascade that it had spent decades preventing.
Exactly. It will unravel the NPT, and all of a sudden, all over Asia, you're going to see Malaysia, other countries do this. You're going to see in Latin America, the Brazilians, the Argentinians are going to say, what? Why did we give all this up? Now let's reconsider. South Africa gave it up, and they may say, maybe we were too premature. Egypt is out there. Basically you open the door, the barn door, and all the animals are going to run out. And we're already at the point where the barn doors creaked open because of Iran and North Korea, and there are a few animals running out. We should be shutting the door rather than opening it wide.
So the bottom line is, we can have a great nuclear energy relationship with Saudi Arabia without providing them the crown jewels.
Yes, exactly.
So, again, to look at this report, there are several points, 5 principles of the American non-proliferation standard, which is American sovereignty and leverage over nuclear tech transfer really matters on the fuel cycle. So we can't outsource this to other countries because of proliferation. Second point, allies matter, but so do standards. So a friend should receive cooperation and fuel assurances in partnership, but they should not receive a sovereign weapons option infrastructure, because this complicates our own defenses and makes it far more expensive and harms our own industry. Third one is that Israel's security is not an afterthought. You don't have Saudi Arabia very upset about the extreme likelihood that Israel has nuclear weapons and the probability that Israel can put them together in minutes if it needs to. The Saudis are only concerned with Iranian nuclear weapons. So this is a big deal, which leads us to the Abraham Accords, which should raise the standards, not dilute those standards. So you can have the Abraham Accords can anchor a regional civil nuclear compact built on fuel assurances and transparency and no sovereign enrichment. And then the last point, American industry should win, but again, not by selling the crown jewels.
Look, I mean, we don't want other nations like the Chinese or the Russians being the benefactors here. We've done this too often, and we should be the benefactors here. As far as the our Abraham Accords goes, it should become the gateway to having access to this consortium. And that also is an incentive to nations to finally enter peace with Israel and be part of the Abraham Accords, because that is their gateway. If you're not part of it, you shouldn't be allowed to enter the gateway. So in many ways, it reinforces the Abraham Accords, and the Abraham Accords reinforces the nuclear control. But in the end, I think the principle also has to be America first, which is that we shouldn't be doing this unless, I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't be the benefactor of it. After all, it's our idea, it's our technology, and we will be the most responsible in ensuring that it won't be diverted. And I mean, we have now, unfortunately, even the Europeans with Urenco, that is the source of most of the proliferation in the world. So we saw what happened with their controls, and we also see how Europe is very good about rhetorically being determined to stop proliferation, but in practicalities, they're unwilling to assert their power.
Yeah, they've always been double dealers on these kinds of things, even with the Soviets.
We need a nation that has power and will to enforce this, and the UN has failed, and the Europeans have failed over time.
Great. Well, that's a wrap on our paper. Hold the line on enrichment for the Center for Security Policy's new non-proliferation paper. We had the collaboration of policy people as well as nuclear engineers and people working in the Middle East all coming together to put this project together for us. So, Dave Wurmser, it's been great talking to you about it.